The river didn't care that she couldn't swim. June Calder had known that about rivers since she was 7, back when her cousin Danny dared her past the rope swing at Miller's Creek and the current pulled her under for 4 seconds that felt like 4 years. She'd promised herself, with the total conviction only a 7-year-old can manage, that she would never again get into water she couldn't stand up in. 24 years later, she jumped into one anyway. It was that or stay, and staying meant the room at the end of the hallway, the one with the drain in the floor and the bolt on the outside of the door. She had heard what happened in that room, through 2 walls, muffled, and somewhere around hour 60 of being held in the old grain warehouse outside Calder's Bend, no relation, just a cruel little coincidence of geography, she had decided drowning was the better option. So when Dempsey left the side door unchained for 11 minutes, because his replacement was late and he wanted a cigarette, June didn't think. Thinking was the enemy it took time, and time was the one thing she didn't have. She moved, bare feet on gravel, cold air that tasted like metal and diesel. The fence line, lower than she remembered from the one time they'd marched her across the yard, low enough that she got a leg over before anyone shouted. Someone shouted. Then there were lights, boots on gravel behind her, and the black ribbon of the river ahead, swollen from 3 days of rain, moving faster than any river had a right to move in October. She didn't decide to jump. Her body decided. Her body had apparently been keeping its own counsel this whole time, separate from the part of her still standing in a locked room, doing math about how many days had passed, and now it took over and ran her straight off the bank into 11 feet of black water without asking permission from the rest of her. The cold hit like a wall, not like getting in slowly, toes first, the way she used to ease into the lake every summer with her dad standing in the shallows pretending to be a sea monster. This was a slap, a full-body slap that knocked the air out of her before she even went under, and then she was under, and the current had her, and she understood with sudden, drowning clarity why she'd spent her whole life staying out of water she couldn't stand up in. She came up once, got half a breath, heard a voice that might have been Dempsey, or might have been the wind. Then the river pulled her down again, like it had been waiting for the chance. This is how it ends, she thought, with the strange calm that sometimes arrives, right behind real panic, like panic's quieter sibling. Not in the warehouse, not in the room with the drain. Here, in a river outside a town she'd never heard of 3 weeks ago, 28 years old, no will, no goodbye. Nobody who'd even know to look in the right county. Her lungs burned. Her arms had stopped fighting somewhere in the last 10 seconds, gone heavy and stupid, more interested in floating limp than in saving her. The current spun her once, lazily, like it had all the time in the world, and she had none of it. Then, something closed around her wrist. Not gentle, a grip like a manacle, cold even through the cold of the river, and it didn't let go when she thrashed against it the way every other hand that had grabbed her in the last 3 weeks hadn't let go either. For one terrible second her body assumed the worst, assumed this was Dempsey, assumed the river had only delayed the room with the drain by a few minutes. Then, she was moving the wrong direction. Up, not down. Out, not in. She broke the surface, coughing up half the river, and the night air hit her face like a second slap, and somewhere above her a voice said something she couldn't process yet, because her brain was still 3 feet underwater, still doing the math on how many days, how many hours, how much longer she could have lasted. "You're all right," the voice said. It did not sound like Dempsey. It did not sound like anyone from the warehouse. It had an accent she couldn't place, careful, like every word had been chosen rather than spoken. "I have you. Stop fighting me. You'll pull us both under." She fought him anyway, because 3 weeks of being grabbed by men with cold hands had taught her exactly one lesson. Never stop fighting, not even when your arms are jelly, not even when the water's in your lungs, not even when some small traitor part of you wants to just let go and rest. "I'm not one of them," the voice said, closer now, low against her ear. And there was something in how he said it not pleading, just stating a fact about the weather that made her stop. For one fatal half-second, fighting, that was enough. He had her against him then, one arm locked across her chest, moving through water that should have been pulling them both under with an ease that didn't belong to anything human. Cutting toward the far bank like the current was a suggestion he'd decided to ignore. She got one good look at him before the world went gray at the edges. Dark hair plastered to a face too still to be afraid, eyes the color of water under ice, and an expression she would spend weeks trying to name. Because it wasn't surprise, and it wasn't triumph. It looked like relief. The specific relief of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something to finally happen. Then, the gray took her completely, and June Calder stopped thinking about anything at all. Output Section 2, she woke up warm, which was wrong, because the last thing she remembered was being colder than she'd ever been in her life. June kept her eyes shut for a moment, doing the thing she'd learned in the warehouse: take inventory before you let anyone know you're awake. Soft surface under her. A blanket, heavy, smelled like cedar. No rope on her wrists, no ache in her shoulders from being zip-tied to a chair. Her own clothes were gone. She was in something dry and oversized, a shirt that hung past her knees. She opened her eyes. The room was old in a way that didn't match the warehouse's kind of old. Stone walls, but clean, lived in. A fireplace with an actual fire in it, throwing orange light across furniture that looked like it belonged behind a velvet rope in a museum. Tall windows, black with night. No bars. No drain in the floor. She was off the bed and across the room before she'd finished deciding to move, grabbing the nearest thing that could pass for a weapon, a heavy brass candlestick off the mantel, and putting her back to the wall by the door, the way she'd practiced in her head 100 times in that warehouse without ever getting the chance. "You won't need that," a voice said from the corner. She hadn't seen him. That was the first wrong thing: a man her own height, plus 6 inches, sitting in a wingback chair not 10 feet from the bed, and she hadn't clocked him until he spoke. The second wrong thing was that he didn't move when she spun toward him, didn't flinch at the candlestick, just watched her with an expression of polite, almost academic interest, like she was a door he was waiting to see whether she'd open on her own. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question. A demand dressed up as one. "My name is Varen." He said it the way you'd give your name to a customs officer. "You jumped into the Calder River 4 hours ago. I pulled you out. You're in my home now, about 11 miles from the warehouse, and no one followed us. You know about the warehouse. I know a great many things." He didn't elaborate, and that was what made the hair go up on the back of her neck. "You're safe here. You don't have to believe that yet. I'm not asking you to put down the candlestick." She didn't put it down. "How do I know you're not?" She stopped. Not one of them seemed too small a phrase for what she meant. "How do I know this isn't just a nicer room?" Something moved across his face, there and gone, and for a second he looked less like a man being patient with a frightened stranger, and more like one absorbing a hit he'd been bracing for. "You don't," he said. "You have no reason to take my word over your own instincts. Your instincts kept you alive 3 weeks. I'd be a fool to ask you to override them now." It wasn't the answer she expected. She'd expected reassurance, the kind men always reached for first. "I promise. You can trust me," and instead he'd just agreed with her, flatly, like trust was something built rather than handed over because he asked nicely. "I want to see a phone," she said. "I want to call my sister. There's one downstairs. I'll take you as soon as you're steady enough to walk, which, by my estimate, isn't yet. You went under for almost 4 minutes, and your body temperature was 29 degrees when I pulled you out. Sit down before you fall down. I'd rather not catch you twice in one night." She did not sit down. "On principle. You're cold," she said instead, because she'd noticed it now, that the adrenaline was draining out of her. He hadn't gone near the fire once, hadn't pulled a blanket around himself, was sitting in a stone room in October with his sleeves rolled up like the temperature didn't apply to him. Why aren't you cold? You were in that river too. I run cold, he said, which was true, and also, she'd understand much later. The single largest understatement of the entire conversation. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have tonight. She studied him properly for the first time, dark hair, dry now, a stillness that should have read as relaxed, and instead read as something closer to a held breath, though his chest hadn't moved once since she'd started watching for it, which she filed away in the part of her brain that had spent 3 weeks cataloging details that might matter later. His eyes were pale, gray-blue, and didn't track around the room the way most people's eyes did when they talked. They stayed on her, unhurried, like he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. Which, given that it was she glanced at a clock on the mantel nearly 2 in the morning, was its own kind of strange. "Why'd you pull me out?" she asked. "You don't know me." And there it was again, that flicker, quick as a struck match. "I should let you rest," he said, instead of answering, which she noticed, because not answering a question was its own kind of answer if you'd had enough practice reading men who didn't want to tell you things. "That's not what I asked." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He stood, unfolding out of the chair with an economy that made her tighten her grip on the candlestick again, and crossed to the door, not toward her, around her, a wide, deliberate berth she clocked and filed away to. At the threshold he paused, hand on the frame, and looked back with an expression she couldn't read yet, though she would spend the next several weeks learning to. "You asked how I knew about the warehouse," he said. "The truth is, I've known where you were for longer than you'd believe me if I told you tonight. Get some sleep, June. We'll talk in the morning." He was gone before she could ask the only question that mattered, lodged sideways in her throat like a fishbone. She hadn't told him her name. Output Section 3 morning came through the tall windows like an apology, soft and gray, and June woke up still holding the candlestick. She'd fallen asleep with it under the blanket like a kid with a stuffed animal, which was either the most pathetic or the most sensible thing she'd done in 3 weeks. She lay there a minute, listening. No footsteps. No voices. Just the pop of a fire that had been built up again sometime while she slept, which meant someone had been in the room without waking her, which should have terrified her and instead, strangely, didn't. She found a robe at the foot of the bed that hadn't been there last night, and a pair of slippers, and decided that whatever Varin was, he ran a tight ship in the hospitality department. The hallway outside her room was stone too, lined with paintings that looked old enough to have their own zip codes, and she patted down it barefoot inside the slippers, candlestick still in one hand because old habits surrendered slowly. She found a staircase, then a kitchen modern, jarringly so, all steel and marble after the medieval hallway, like someone had grafted a different century onto the house, out of necessity rather than taste. There was a man in the kitchen who was not Varin. He was shorter, fair-haired, somewhere in his 40s by the look of him, wearing a cardigan that probably cost more than her car, and he was on the phone, pacing, talking, in the clipped tones of someone who'd had this exact conversation 100 times and resented having it 101st. "No," he was saying. "No, I understand the council's position. I simply don't agree with it. And there's a difference. Because he is the sovereign, and he's permitted a private life, the same as anyone, yes, I'm aware of the precedent. I was alive for the precedent. He turned, saw her, and stopped talking with the abruptness of a man caught discussing the thing he wasn't supposed to discuss. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, and hung up without waiting for a response. Then, to June, with a small, formal bow that looked completely out of place over a granite countertop. "You're awake. Good. I'm Corwin. I manage the household. Tea or coffee?" "Who were you talking to?" A very persistent man named Holloway, who would like nothing more than to make his job difficult by making mine difficult first. "Tea or coffee?" "Coffee," she said, mostly because she didn't know what else to do with her hands besides hold the candlestick, which she was still holding, and Corwin's gaze flicked to it without comment, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "Where's Varen?" "Attending to business he's neglected since approximately 1:15 this morning, when he came through that door carrying you and informed me, and I quote, that everything else could wait." Corwin set a cup in front of her with the precision of a man who took small rituals seriously. "He'll be back before evening. He asked me to tell you, the phone, the grounds, anything in the house is yours to use, and that the front gate is open, not locked, should you wish to leave." He was very specific about the not locked part. That stopped her with the cup halfway to her mouth. "He's letting me leave. He's letting you choose," Corwin said, and something in the careful way he said choose told her this was a word with weight behind it in this house. Whether that's the same thing as, I suppose, up to you. She drank the coffee. It was good, better than good, and she hated how much that small kindness did to the knot that had been sitting in her chest for 3 weeks. "How long have you worked for him?" Corwin considered the question with the air of a man deciding how much truth a stranger had earned. "Longer than is probably healthy for either of us," he said. "I started in his service in 1789. I've buried 4 wives and outlived 2 careers, and I am to this day the only person in his employ who will tell him no to his face, which is either a great honor or a terrible curse, depending on the week." She set the cup down very carefully. 1789, yes. That's not people don't know. He agreed. They don't. I'm not the right person to explain the rest of it. That's his to tell, and he's been putting it off for longer than you'd believe. June looked around the kitchen, at the steel and marble grafted onto 800 years of stone, and felt the floor of her understanding tilt very slightly, the way it had on the riverbank when she'd looked up and seen an expression that didn't belong on the face of a stranger. "Putting it off how long?" she asked. Corwin's expression did something complicated, fond and tired, and a little sad all at once. The look of a man who'd watched the same scene unfold from the wings more times than he wanted to count. "Finish your coffee," he said instead of answering. "There's something in the study you should probably see before he gets back. He doesn't know I know about it, and he definitely doesn't know I'm about to show you, so we should be quick." He led her down a different hallway, past a library that smelled like old paper and wood smoke, to a study with a desk the size of a small boat and, on the wall behind it, a single framed photograph that didn't belong with anything else in the room, not old, not formal, just a snapshot. Slightly faded, of a street fair somewhere with strings of lights overhead. June stepped closer. Her stomach dropped before her mind caught up to why. She was in the photograph, 16 years old, laughing at something off camera, a funnel cake in one hand, a version of herself she barely recognized because nobody had been looking at her like that in a long time, and she had never, in her entire life, seen this picture before. "That fair," Corwin said quietly, "was the summer you were 16. Your father took it. He's the man standing just out of frame, on the left, though you can't see him in this crop." He paused. "Varen has had that photograph for 12 years. Output Section 4, Output Section 4. She didn't leave through the open gate. She told herself it was because she was still too weak to walk 11 miles in October. Which was even true, mostly. But it wasn't the whole truth, and June had never been great at lying to herself, even when she was excellent at lying to everyone else. She spent the day in the garage instead. Of course there was a garage, a long stone outbuilding behind the house, with 3 cars in it, that probably cost more combined than every vehicle she'd ever worked on, including a 67-something with its hood already up, mid-repair, abandoned the way you abandon a project when something more urgent interrupts you. She stood over the engine until her hands started moving on their own, the part of her brain that didn't need permission to recognize a sticking valve. She had her uncle's garage back home called her auto, no relation to the river either, and she'd been running it alone since he died 2 years ago. It was honest work. It kept her hands busy and her head quiet, which she'd needed more than usual lately, what with her mom gone and her brother being her brother. Eli, that was the actual reason she was standing in a stranger's garage with grease under her fingernails instead of walking down a dirt road toward a town she didn't know the name of. Her brother had always been the soft one, the one their mother worried about, the one who needed 3 tries to keep a job. Somewhere in the last year he'd found a faster way to make money than their family had ever known how to make. She didn't know the details. She knew he'd borrowed from the wrong people, and that when he couldn't pay, they'd come looking for collateral, and Eli, useless, soft-hearted, 26-year-old Eli, had given them her name instead of his own. She hadn't even gotten to be angry yet. There hadn't been time. One day she was closing the shop at 6, and the next she was waking up Zip tied in the back of a van with a bag over her head. Corwin found her like that, elbow deep in someone else's engine, 3 hours later. "He's back," he said from the doorway, holding 2 mugs. "I thought you might want warning before he tries to talk to you about anything emotionally significant, which he'll do badly. Because despite 8 centuries of practice, he remains catastrophic at it." 8 centuries, she repeated, because apparently she'd needed to hear someone else say it before it became a fact, instead of a thing Corwin had implied earlier that she'd decided not to fully process. "Give or take. I've never asked the precise number." Felt rude, she wiped her hands on a rag that was probably worth more than her own jeans, and took the mug he offered. "Why's he scared to talk to me?" Corwin's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "He's not scared. He's careful. There's a difference, though it doesn't always look like one from the outside." He paused. He found out about the photograph. "I told him I showed you. He was not thrilled with me." "Good," June said. "Somebody should be in trouble around here besides me." She found Varen in the study an hour later, standing exactly where the photograph hung, like he'd been standing there since he got back. "Corwin showed you the photo," he said without turning around. "He did. I asked him not to keep things from you. I should have specified that didn't include the things I was keeping from you myself. Something almost dry in it, almost funny, landing strangely against the weight of the room. Sit down. I'll tell you what I can." 12 years, she said instead of sitting. "You've had a picture of me from when I was 16 for 12 years. That's not a coincidence. That's not you happening to pull a stranger out of a river last night." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. So tell me." He turned around, and for the first time since the riverbank, she saw something close to nervousness on a face that had otherwise been unreadable as a closed door. "There was a fire," he said, 12 years ago. A grain elevator fire outside your hometown. You'd have been 16, watching it from the road with friends, because everyone in town came out to watch. She remembered it. Of course she remembered it, the whole sky orange, the heat from 400 yards away, her dad's hand on her shoulder. "Don't you dare get any closer." "There was a man trapped on the 3rd floor," Varen said. "The fire department's ladder didn't reach. Nobody got him out in time. Officially, he didn't survive." "What does that have to do with I was passing through?" he said. "Wasn't going to involve myself. Wasn't my business, my century, my country." Then I looked down at the road and saw a 16-year-old standing closer to that fire than anyone else, closer than her own father wanted her to be. And she wasn't watching it the way everyone else was watching it. She was counting the windows, trying to work out if anyone was still inside. June's mouth had gone dry. I was trying to see if the upper floor was clear before the wall came down. My uncle taught me fire behavior. I used to want to be a firefighter, he finished. "I know. You told your friend Casey that night, on that road, that you were going to apply to the academy as soon as you turned 18. She had told Casey that. She remembered it. She had never told anyone else, and Casey had moved to Phoenix 9 years ago, and they hadn't spoken since. "How do you know that?" she said, smaller than she meant it to come out. "Because I was standing close enough to hear you," Varen said. "And it's the reason I went back into that building for the man on the 3rd floor, instead of walking away like I'd planned to. You made me want to be the kind of thing worth a 16-year-old's faith in firefighters. I've been watching you, June, on and off, for 12 years, because of one sentence you said to your friend on the worst night of a stranger's life. I'm not proud of how that sounds. I'm telling you anyway, because you asked, and because you deserve better than another person deciding for you what you're allowed to know. Output Section 5, June sat down then. Finally, because her legs had stopped being reliable sometime in the last 30 seconds, and the chair was closer than the floor. 12 years, she said again, like saying it twice might make it smaller. On and off, you said. What does on and off mean? Varen didn't sit. He stood by the window with his hands behind his back, the posture of a man giving testimony he'd rehearsed and still wasn't sure he'd survive. It means I didn't follow you to school. I didn't watch you sleep. I'm not, he stopped, visibly searching for a word that wouldn't make this worse. I checked. Periodically, that you were well, that nothing had happened to you that I could have prevented and chose not to. Checked how. There are people, mortal people, paid well, who do not ask questions about why a man wants to know if a particular auto shop in a particular town is still solvent. He said it like a confession, which, she supposed, it was. 3 years ago your transmission needed replacing, and you didn't have the money. You remember that. She did remember that. She remembered crying in the shop bathroom because the quote was $4,000 she didn't have, and then, 2 days later, finding an envelope of cash taped under the register with no note, and deciding it was her uncle's emergency stash she'd forgotten about, because the alternative that someone had simply given her $4,000 didn't fit anywhere in her understanding of how the world worked. That was you. Yes, and the parts truck that didn't show up the night those two guys tried to break into the shop. The cops said a neighbor must have scared them off. There was no neighbor. She put her face in her hands. Not crying, not yet, just needing the dark for a second, while her whole life rearranged itself behind her eyes. Every piece of luck she'd ever quietly thanked nobody in particular for it had a name now. It had cold hands and a stillness that didn't read as human, and an accent that belonged to a century she couldn't picture. You've been managing my life, she said into her palms. I would call it managing the worst of my own guilt, he said, which I recognize doesn't make it better. I didn't insert myself into your life, June. I removed the things that would have ended it before it had the chance to be yours. There's a difference, even if I understand why it doesn't feel like one from where you're sitting. It doesn't. She looked up. It feels like I've been a project. Something you check on. Something you fund. You don't know me. You know facts about me. That's not the same thing as knowing someone. Something in his face went very still, stiller than his usual stillness, which she hadn't thought possible. You're right, he said simply, no defense in it at all. I know what you said to a friend at 16, and I know what your transmission cost, and I know you take your coffee black because you stopped trusting yourself to remember to buy creamer. I don't know what you wanted to be at 25 instead of 26, after the firefighter thing didn't happen. I don't know why you stayed in that town when your friend Casey left for Phoenix. I don't know if you're happy, June. I've spent 12 years making sure you were safe, and never once asking whether safe and happy were the same address. The honesty of it knocked something loose in her chest, something she'd been holding rigid since the warehouse, since before the warehouse, maybe since the transmission money and the parts truck, and 100 small mercies she'd attributed to luck, because the truth had never once occurred to her as a possibility. I don't know if I'm happy either, she admitted, and it came out rougher than she meant it to. 3 weeks of captivity, and 12 years of unknowing luck collapsing into one sentence in a stranger's study. I fix cars, and I worry about Eli, and I haven't taken a vacation in 4 years because the shop doesn't run itself, and 3 days ago some men I'd never met decided I was worth less than my brother's gambling debt, and I jumped into a river to avoid finding out what they meant to do about it. I don't know what happy even looks like anymore. I just know I want to choose it myself, whatever it is. Not have it arranged for me by a man with a $4,000 envelope and no return address. That's fair, Varen said quietly. I'm furious at you, she added, because it felt important to say out loud, to make sure he understood it wasn't gratitude doing the talking. I'm furious, and I'm also, she stopped. Hated the next word before she said it. Grateful. Both. at the same time. I don't know how to hold both of those at once, and I resent that you put me in the position of having to figure it out. You don't have to figure it out today. I jumped into a river yesterday, Varen. Today is already doing a lot of work. That got something close to a real smile out of him. Brief, surprised. Like his face wasn't used to the shape, and was testing whether it still fit. Fair, he said again. Then today, all I'll ask is this. Stay until you're steady enough to leave on solid ground, under your own power, with a working phone and a clear head, instead of the way you arrived. After that, the choice is entirely yours, and I won't manage it from a distance the way I have everything else. You have my word. Your word from a man who's been quietly running my life for over a decade. Yes, he said. I'm aware of how that sounds. It's the only kind of word I have to give you. Output section 6, output section 6. She didn't leave that night, or the next, or the one after that, and somewhere around day 4, she stopped pretending to herself that the not leaving was about her legs. It was easier to admit that at 2 in the morning, when the house was quiet, and Corwin had gone to whatever Corwin did when he wasn't managing a household and a king's emotional avoidance simultaneously, and June found herself in the kitchen making tea she didn't want because her hands needed a job and her brain wouldn't stop circling the same drain. Varen found her there, the way he seemed to find her everywhere, though she'd noticed he always announced himself first now, a word from the doorway, footsteps that made noise when they didn't strictly need to. She'd mentioned, once, offhand, that it unsettled her when people moved without sound, and he'd apparently filed that the same way he filed everything, permanently, and adjusted. Can't sleep, he said. Not a question. You'd know. You don't either. No. He leaned against the counter, the appropriate distance away, another thing he'd started doing without being asked. What's keeping you up? She wrapped both hands around the mug. I keep doing the math. 3 weeks in that warehouse. 12 years of you fixing things behind my back before that. 28 years of being the one who holds everything together because nobody else in my family ever learned how. I'm trying to figure out where, in any of that math, I actually got to decide anything for myself. You decided to jump into a river instead of waiting to find out what they meant to do with you. That's not a decision. That's an animal instinct with a body attached. It's still yours, he said. Nobody made that choice for you. Nobody arranged it from a distance with an envelope of cash. You looked at 2 impossible options, and you picked the one that meant fighting for your own life instead of surrendering it to someone else's plan. I'd call that the most decisive thing I've watched a person do in longer than you'd believe. She studied him over the rim of the mug. You're trying to make me feel better. I'm trying to tell you the truth. Whether it makes you feel better is a side effect I don't control. That, annoyingly, did make her feel better, and she hated how easily he managed it, how he never reached for the soft, obvious thing, you're so strong, you're amazing, and instead handed her something specific enough to actually land. Can I ask you something? She said. And you have to actually answer, not do the thing where you go quiet and change the subject. I'll do my best. I make no promises about the quiet thing. It's 800 years of habit. What happens to you if you don't feed? You haven't, I've been watching, since I figured out what you are. You haven't left at night the way I'd expect. You've just been here. Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and careful. I feed rarely, less than I should if I'm honest, which has become something of a pattern around you specifically. Why? Because the easiest way to feed without causing harm requires a kind of closeness I haven't wanted to extend to anyone in a very long time, and the harder way requires leaving you here alone at night, in a house with an open gate, 3 days after a river and a warehouse, and I find I don't care for that option either. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, like a man reading a weather report rather than confessing something. So I've been managing without, for now. It's not sustainable indefinitely. It is sustainable for the time being. That sounds bad. That sounds like the thing that happened to you 11 nights into knowing a different woman a long time ago, isn't it? Corwin mentioned something. Not details. Just that you have history with not eating around women you like. A pause. Longer than his usual pauses. Corwin talks too much. Corwin's the only honest person in this house besides me. Don't be mad at him for doing his job. He's not the one whose job is honesty. That would be the triage nurse from his stories, and she's not currently standing in my kitchen at 2 a.m. interrogating my eating habits. The words came out before he seemed to fully intend them, and something crossed his face, not embarrassment exactly, but close to it. The look of a man who'd let slip a piece of a story he hadn't meant to reference. Who's the triage nurse? Nobody, friend. Long story long ago, not relevant tonight. You're doing the quiet thing. I am aware. She let it go, mostly because she recognized the shape of a wall when she saw one, having built several herself over the last 3 weeks, and pushing on someone else's felt hypocritical before breakfast. Instead, she reached over and took his hand. The cold of it no longer the shock it had been on day 1, just a fact about him now, like the gray-blue eyes or the accent that belonged to a century she'd never visit. Go feed, she said. Properly tonight, I'll be fine. The gate's open and I have a candlestick and apparently a king's word that he won't manage my life from a distance anymore. You're ordering me to leave. I'm ordering you to take care of yourself for once, instead of me. Revolutionary concept, I know. He looked down at where her hand sat over his, smaller, warmer, undeniably alive in a way his hadn't been in longer than most countries had existed, and something in his expression cracked open the way it had on the riverbank, the specific relief of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something to finally happen. I'll be back before dawn, he said. I know, she said. I'll be here. Output Section 7, Output Section 7. She'd never actually said the word out loud, she realized, 3 days after the conversation in the kitchen. Vampire. She'd talked around it, talked through it, built an entire functioning relationship on top of it, without once making herself say the 4 syllables that explained the cold hands and the no breathing, and the way he never cast a reflection in the dark glass of the oven door, which she'd noticed on day 2, and decided not to mention, because some things you process at your own pace. She brought it up while she was under the 67's hood, because it turned out the easiest way to have a hard conversation with Varen was to give her hands something else to do at the same time. The same trick that had gotten her through every difficult talk with patients back when she'd briefly considered Emptwork before the garage swallowed her whole life instead. You're a vampire, she said, to the engine block, not to him, though he was standing 6 feet away holding a flashlight she hadn't asked for, and he'd produced anyway. I should probably just say it. I've been saying what you are for 3 days like it's a medical condition I don't want to diagnose out loud. It is, in a sense, a medical condition, he said, just not one your training prepared you for. My training prepared me for plenty. No pulse, low body temp, no respiration unless you're performing it for an audience. Aversion to direct sunlight. You've never once stood in that west window past 9 a.m. I clocked that on day 3 and a diet that isn't food. That's not a mystery, Varen. That's a chart. I just hadn't written the diagnosis at the top of it yet. And now you have. Now I have. She tightened a bolt that didn't need tightening, mostly for something to do with her hands while the words settled. How's it work? The feeding. You said 2 nights ago there's an easy way and a harder way. The easy way involves willing participants, paid, who understand the arrangement and are compensated generously and discreetly. It's a transaction. Clean. It doesn't require closeness, which is, for centuries at a time, exactly what I've preferred. He set the flashlight down on the workbench. The harder way involves someone I actually care for, which carries risk I haven't taken in longer than I can comfortably admit, because it requires trust on both sides that I haven't had reason to extend since before your country existed. You make it sound very romantic. Bloodletting as relationship milestone. I told you I was catastrophic at this. She laughed, surprised by it, the first real laugh she'd managed since the warehouse, and it came out a little rusty, like a hinge that hadn't been used. He watched her do it with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that looked like a man memorizing something he was afraid he'd be asked to give back. Over the next several days, the house settled into something that almost resembled a routine, which struck her as absurd, given that 2 of the 3 people in it weren't technically alive in any sense she'd have recognized a month ago. Corwin brought her coffee every morning at 7, unprompted, in a mug that said nothing and matched nothing, just plain white, because she'd mentioned once that she found novelty mugs exhausting, and apparently that too had been filed and acted on. Varen learned, slowly and with visible effort, the specific choreography of human need, that she got cold around 4 in the afternoon regardless of the actual temperature, that she couldn't sleep without some kind of background noise, that she hated being asked if she was okay, and preferred being handed a task instead, because a task she could manage, and a feeling she sometimes couldn't. He was bad at some of it, spectacularly, almost endearingly bad. He bought her 17 kinds of tea before realizing she only drank 1, because he hadn't wanted to ask and risk getting it wrong, which she pointed out was a strange kind of logic for a man who'd apparently had no trouble tracking her transmission repairs from 1,000 miles away for over a decade. That was different, he said, when she brought it up, sitting across from her at the long kitchen table with 17 boxes of tea between them like evidence at a trial. That was solving a problem, I understood. This is he gestured at the tea. At her. At the general undefined territory of trying to make a person feel cared for, without making her feel managed. This I don't entirely know how to do without doing it wrong. You're not doing it wrong. You're doing it like someone who's never had to ask for permission before, and is finding out the asking is the actual hard part. Yes, he said, with the relief of a man who'd just been handed the correct diagnosis. That. Exactly that. It was good, those days, quiet in a way her life hadn't been quiet in years, not since before her mother got sick, not since before the shop, not since before she'd learned to read every room she walked into for threats, before she'd learned to read it for anything else. She caught herself, twice, forgetting to check the exits when she entered a room. She caught herself once laughing at something Corwin said with her whole chest, no calculation behind it at all. It was Corwin who broke it, on the 7th evening, standing in the kitchen doorway with his phone in his hand and an expression that hadn't been on his face since the morning he'd shown her the photograph. "Your Majesty," he said, and the formality of it, after a week of casual house arrest, landed in the room like a dropped plate. "We have a problem. There's been a sighting. A man matching Dempsey's description, 2 towns over, asking questions at gas stations about a woman who fixes cars." Output Section 8, Output Section 8 Dempsey, June repeated. Her stomach dropped somewhere south of her boots. How does he know to look 2 towns over? He doesn't, not specifically. He's casting a wide net gas stations, diners, anywhere a woman with no car and no money might surface looking for work or transportation. It's not intelligence. It's persistence. Corwin's voice had gone carefully even, the tone she now recognized as the one he used when he was managing 2 crises at once and didn't want either party to notice he was doing it. "There's a second matter, Your Majesty, and I'd rather not deliver it in front of in front of her," Varen said. "She's not leaving the room every time something concerns her. We've established that." Corwin's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "The Council knows. Lord Holloway's people have eyes everywhere you go. You know this, and a week of you missing every session, every audience, every scheduled feeding it didn't take a genius. He's called an emergency session for tomorrow night. He intends to raise the matter of harboring a mortal in violation of the 6th Accord. The 6th Accord is 300 years old, and was written about something else entirely," Varen said. And for the first time since the riverbank, June heard something sharp under the careful, measured voice, something that had teeth. The 6th Accord prohibits sustained, undisclosed cohabitation with immortal outside sanctioned arrangements, Your Majesty. And I would point out that written about something else entirely has never once stopped Holloway from using a law exactly as broadly as it benefits him to use it. June looked between them. "Sanctioned arrangements. What does that mean?" "It means," Varen said, "that the court has, historically, permitted relationships with mortals only under specific conditions, disclosure, time limits, an understanding that it ends a particular way. It does not account for a mortal who knows what I am, lives under my roof, and has not signed anything, agreed to anything, or been formally presented as anything other than what she is, which is a woman I pulled out of a river because I couldn't make myself walk away. That's a beautiful sentiment, Your Majesty, and it will mean nothing to Holloway, who has wanted your seat on the council since approximately the Restoration, and will use any opening you give him. Corwin's hands were shaking slightly, she noticed, the first crack she'd seen in his composure all week. I've held him off twice this month with scheduling excuses. I cannot hold off an emergency session called in his own right as council elder. What happens if he wins this? June asked. Whatever winning means here. The silence that followed told her more than either of them seemed willing to. Sanctions, at minimum, Varen said finally. Restricted movement, forced disclosure of your location to the council registry, which I will not allow, because a registry is a list, and lists leak, and you have men with guns looking for you 2 towns over without any help from a clerical error. At worst, he stopped. At worst, separation, Corwin finished. When it became clear Varen wasn't going to. The council has the authority to enforce distance between a sovereign and a mortal they deem a liability to the crown's stability. It's been invoked 4 times in 3 centuries. Each time, Your Majesty, it worked. The relationship ended, not because either party wanted it to, because the council made staying together cost more than either of them could pay. June sat down at the long table, the 17 boxes of tea still scattered across it, like evidence nobody had cleared away, and tried to make her brain hold both facts at once: a trafficker 2 towns over with her photo on his phone, and a council of immortals 300 miles away, deciding whether she was a liability worth legislating against. This is insane, she said, mostly to the tea. A week ago my biggest problem was a transmission that needed replacing and a brother who owed money to the wrong people. Now I'm being discussed by a vampire council like I'm a zoning violation. I'm sorry, Varen said, and meant it in a way that made the apology land heavier than she expected. This is precisely the kind of thing I was trying to spare you by managing things from a distance. I'm aware that's not a defense, it's an explanation, and a poor one. It's not a great explanation, she agreed, but it's an honest one, which is apparently rare enough in your world that I should probably take it. She looked up. What do you want to do? Not what you think you should do because of some 300-year-old accord. What do you actually want? He didn't answer immediately, which she'd learned by now meant he was telling the truth instead of reaching for the easy version of it. I want to go to that session tomorrow night, he said, and tell Holloway and the entire council exactly what I told you in the kitchen a week ago, that I've been watching over you for 12 years because of one sentence you said to a friend on the worst night of a stranger's life, and that I am done pretending that means nothing, simply because the law was written by men who never once felt it. He paused. I want to do that with your permission, not instead of it. This is your life they'll be discussing. You should have a say in how it's defended. Corwin made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been despair. In 400 years, Your Majesty, that may be the single most reasonable thing I've heard you say in a crisis. June looked at the tea boxes, at Corwin's shaking hands, at Varen's careful, waiting stillness, and felt something settle in her chest that hadn't been there since the warehouse, not safety exactly, not yet, but the specific, unfamiliar weight of being asked, instead of decided for. Take me with you, she said. If they're going to discuss my life, I want to be in the room. The council chamber wasn't what she expected. No torches, no thrones, nothing out of the Gothic novels she'd half-read in high school, just a long modern room, with a long modern table, fluorescent lighting that looked deeply wrong on the assembled faces around it, and the specific tension of a corporate board meeting where everyone already knew how the vote would go, and was attending anyway out of obligation. Lord Holloway sat at the far end. He was younger looking than she expected, blonde, expensively dressed, with a smile that arrived a half-second before his eyes caught up to it, which she clocked immediately as the kind of smile that had never once meant what it appeared to mean. "Nurse Doyle," he started, and Corwin, beside her, made a small strangled sound. "I'm sorry I seem to be confusing my files. You're not a nurse. You're a mechanic." How refreshingly different from His Majesty's usual type. "There's no usual type," Varen said. "There's been one. Centuries apart. You've made a study of my private life, Holloway, which says rather more about your evenings than mine." A ripple of something, not quite laughter, but clothes moved down the table, and Holloway's smile thinned by a fraction. "The matter before this council," he said, "is straightforward. The Sovereign has, by his own admission, been harboring a mortal who possesses full knowledge of our nature, without disclosure to this body, without sanctioned terms, for a period exceeding the limits set by the Sixth Accord. I move that the Council enforce immediate separation, pending formal review. The Sixth Accord," Varen said, "was written to prevent sovereigns from feeding indiscriminately on unwitting populations under cover of relationships. It has nothing to do with this. June knows precisely what I am. She diagnosed it herself from a chart of symptoms, the way she diagnoses every patient who comes through her door. There is no deception here for the Accord to prevent. The Accord doesn't require deception, Your Majesty, only undisclosed cohabitation, and you have not disclosed this to the Council until you were caught failing to attend 4 consecutive sessions." Holloway's gaze slid to June with the particular interest of a man examining something he intended to use later. "Tell me, Miss Calder, do you understand what you're agreeing to? Our king does not age. You will. He will watch you decline across decades while he remains exactly as he is now. He has done this twice before, by his own court's record, and both times it ended in grief significant enough to require centuries of recovery. Are you prepared to be the third?" The room went very quiet. June felt every eye on her, felt the specific weight of being discussed as a liability rather than a person, the exact thing Corwin had warned her about, and something in her, the part that had spent 3 weeks in a warehouse, refusing to let other people decide the shape of her life, stood up inside her chest before she'd consciously decided to speak. "I'm not agreeing to anything yet," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, the same voice she used on panicking patients, the one that expected to be listened to. "Because nobody's asked me a single real question since I walked in here. You've all spent 10 minutes discussing my mortality like it's a design flaw I need to be protected from. I've spent 28 years aware that I'm going to die someday. I don't need a council of immortals to break that news to me gently." Holloway blinked, recalibrating. "What I do need," she went on, "is for somebody in this room to ask whether I want this, whatever this is, instead of debating whether it's allowed. Because right now, you all sound exactly like the men who decided I was worth less than my brother's debt. Different stakes, same arrogance. Nobody asking the actual person in the room what she wants." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then, from somewhere near the middle of the table, an older woman with silver hair and tired eyes said, quietly, then asked her, "Holloway, you've made this about the Accord. She's made it about consent. I'd like to hear the answer." Holloway's jaw worked. "Fine, Miss Calder. What do you want?" June looked at Varen at the careful stillness, the 800 years of restraint currently doing absolutely nothing to hide how much he wanted her answer to be a particular one, and felt the truth of it settle somewhere solid in her chest, past the fear, past the 3 weeks of captivity, past 12 years of secret transmissions and anonymous envelopes. "I want to decide that on my own timeline," she said. "Not tonight, not under fluorescent lights with a council watching, and not because anyone in this room thinks they have the authority to grant or deny it. I want the chance to find out. That's all I'm asking for, a chance, not a verdict." The silver-haired woman nodded slowly. "I move we table the Accord question for 90 days, pending no further violations, and allow the parties involved to determine their own course." She looked around the table. Second? 3 hands went up. Holloway's did not, but he was outvoted, and June watched something flicker across his face that looked considerably less like defeat than it should have, given the vote. It was as they were leaving, in the corridor outside the chamber, that Corwin's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, and his face, when he answered it, went the color of old paper. "Your Majesty," he said, lowering the phone. "It's a man named Dempsey. He says he has June's brother, and he wants to talk about a trade." "Output Section 10, Output Section 10, Eli," June said, and the floor of the corridor tilted under her, the way it had at the riverbank, the way the world kept tilting every time she thought she'd found solid ground. "He has Eli. Put it on speaker," Varen said, and his voice had gone somewhere June hadn't heard it go before, flat, cold, the voice underneath the careful, patient one he used for tea preferences in council chambers. Dempsey's voice came through tinny and smug, the same voice she'd half heard through two walls in the warehouse, and her whole body remembered it before her mind caught up. There she is. Or, well, there's somebody listening. "June, baby, your brother's been telling us all about his new boss. Apparently you ran off with some rich freak instead of finishing your debt like a reasonable person." "Where is he?" June said, and didn't recognize her own voice. Low and flat, and very, very calm. The calm she'd learned to manufacture for the worst nights in the ER. The kind of calm that sat directly on top of something screaming. "Safe, for now. We're not animals, June. We're businessmen. Your brother owes a number. You ran out on collateral. The math hasn't changed just because you found yourself a sugar daddy with a big house. You want him walking. You bring yourself to the old mill off Route 9, alone by midnight. Your rich friend doesn't come. We see a car that isn't yours. We see anybody who isn't you. Your brother stops being collateral and starts being a liability. And we don't keep liabilities." The line went dead. June stood in the corridor with the phone still glowing in Corwin's hand and felt something cold settle over the fear, something that looked, from the outside, almost like clarity. "I have to go." "You're not going alone," Varen said. He said alone. He said no cars that aren't mine, nobody who isn't me. If he sees you, he won't see me. Varen's eyes had gone dark, that depthless gray blue she remembered from the night he'd told her he hadn't eaten in 11 days, the night his control had been a visible, physical effort. "I am considerably faster than anything Dempsey owns a car for, June, and considerably harder to see than he's prepared for. You'll drive to the mill exactly as instructed. I will already be there. He will never know I arrived." That's insane. What if something goes wrong? What if he has more men than we think? What if then I will be the thing that goes wrong for him? Varen said, and there was nothing soft in it at all. Nothing of the man who'd bought 17 kinds of tea and apologized for not knowing how to ask for permission. This was the part of him the council chamber had been afraid of, she understood suddenly, the part Holloway's 300 years of careful legal maneuvering existed specifically to manage. "I have spent 12 years making certain nothing happened to you that I could prevent. I am not stopping tonight." She drove the truck Corwin produced from somewhere, alone, the headlights cutting through dark countryside she didn't recognize, her hand steady on the wheel in a way that surprised her until she remembered she'd driven through worse, with worse stakes. Back when her mother needed chemo 3 towns over, and June had been the only one with a license and a working car. The mill was exactly what the name suggested, an old brick shell with broken windows, and a chain-link fence somebody had cut a hole in years ago, and nobody had bothered fixing. Dempsey was waiting in the gravel lot with 2 men she didn't recognize, and Eli between them, hands zip-tied, a bruise blooming under one eye that made something in June go white-hot and very, very quiet. "There she is," Dempsey said, spreading his hands like a man welcoming a guest. "Alone, just like we said. I'm almost disappointed. I was hoping for a story to tell." "Let him go," June said. "I'm here. That's the deal. The deal's whatever I say the deal is, sweetheart. That's how collateral works." He nodded at the man holding Eli's arm. "Trade her in. We'll sort out the math on the drive back. And your brother here can go explain to your mother's grave why he's such a—" He didn't finish the sentence, because Dempsey was no longer standing where Dempsey had been standing. It happened too fast for her to track properly a shape, a blur of dark coat and impossible speed, and then Dempsey was 10 feet away, pinned against the brick wall of the mill with his feet not quite touching the ground, and the two men holding Eli had both gone very still. The particular stillness of men whose bodies had just informed them, faster than their brains could process it, that they were in the presence of something they had no framework for surviving. "Let go of him," Varen said, and his voice carried across the gravel lot without seeming to raise itself at all, which somehow made it worse, made every syllable land like something final. Eli's captor let go. Eli stumbled toward June, and she caught him, both of them shaking, while across the lot Varen held Dempsey against the wall with one hand and looked at him with an expression June would later struggle to describe to anyone, because there was no anger in it. Anger would have been easier to explain. What was actually on his face was older than anger, colder, the specific patience of something that had outlived every version of cruelty Dempsey could imagine, and had simply, finally, run out of reasons to be patient with this particular one. "You took something that wasn't yours to take," Varen said quietly. "Twice, now. I find I'm done allowing it. Output Section 11. Output Section 11. He didn't kill him." June would think about that a lot in the days after. Turn it over the way she turned over everything, looking for the angle that made sense of it. He had every reason to, every opportunity. 800 years of patience finally run out against a man holding her brother's arm in a chain-link lot, and instead, he'd held Dempsey against that wall just long enough to make a phone call. Calm, almost bored, to someone who arrived 20 minutes later in an unmarked car and took Dempsey and his two men away to a fate June didn't ask about. And Varen didn't volunteer. "You could have," she said, on the drive back, Eli asleep against the window in the back seat, exhausted past fear into something like shock. "Killed him." I would have understood. "I know," Varen said. "I considered it for longer than I'm proud of. But you've spent 3 weeks proving you don't need someone to solve your problems by becoming a worse version of the people causing them. I didn't want my hands to be the last thing that happened to you tonight. I wanted to be the thing that happened after." She didn't have an answer for that. She watched the dark countryside slide past instead, her brother's slow breathing behind her, and felt something in her chest that she couldn't name yet, too large and too complicated to fit into a single word. It found a name 3 days later, in the kitchen, over coffee Corwin had stopped even pretending wasn't tailored exactly to her preferences. "I need to go home," she said. Varen didn't move, but something in his stillness changed register, the way a held note changes when the breath behind it starts to run out. "All right." Not she stopped, frustrated with herself, with the inadequacy of the words available to her. "Not away from you. Not forever. I need to go be the person who runs a garage and worries about her idiot brother and exists in a life that's mine. For a while. Without a council deciding my mortality is a liability, and without a vampire king 10 steps ahead of every problem, before I've even noticed it's a problem. I watched you hold a man against a wall 3 nights ago like it was nothing. I watched a room full of immortals debate my life expectancy like a spreadsheet line item. That's a lot, Varen. That's a lot for 1 week, on top of 3 weeks before it, on top of 12 years I didn't even know were happening. You're saying you need space. I'm saying I need to know who I am when nobody's managing anything for me. Even you. Especially you, maybe, because you're the easiest person in the world to let manage things, and that scares me more than Dempsey ever did. She wrapped both hands around the mug, the way she had that first night in the kitchen, 2 a.m.s ago that felt like 3 years. I need to go run my shop and figure out what I actually want. Separate from gratitude. Separate from 12 years of envelopes I didn't know to thank you for. I can't tell the difference right now between loving you and just being so relieved someone finally showed up that I'd say yes to anything. It cost him something to hear it. She watched it cost him something. Watched the careful composure hold anyway, because that was apparently who he was at the bottom of 8 centuries, a man who held the composure even when it cost him. Especially when it cost him. I told you once, he said, that I wouldn't manage this from a distance the way I managed everything else. I meant it. If you need to go, you go. The gate's open. It's always been open. He paused, I won't watch you the way I used to. No envelopes. No anonymous repairs. If something breaks, you'll have to call a real mechanic, which I understand is a significant insult to your profession, and I apologize in advance." That surprised a laugh out of her, wet and unexpected, the kind that arrived right behind the thing she'd actually been about to do, which was cry. "You're letting me go." "I'm letting you choose," he corrected gently. "I believe we've already established there's a difference." She left 2 days later, Eli driving them both back in a car Corwin insisted on providing. No card, no note attached, and June didn't argue about it, because some battles weren't worth fighting on a day already this heavy. Varen walked her to the gate himself, the open one, the one that had never once been locked since the night she arrived, soaking and furious and ready to swing a candlestick at the first thing that moved. "I don't know how long," she said. "I'm not counting," he said, which they both knew was a lie, the kind of gentle, necessary lie that let a person walk away without the weight of someone else's waiting following them down the road. She got in the car. She didn't look back, because looking back felt like it might undo whatever fragile, uncertain thing she was trying to build by leaving in the first place, and she was fairly certain that if she saw his face one more time before the gate closed behind her, she wouldn't make it past the end of the driveway. He didn't follow her. Not that week. Not the next. The garage reopened. The transmission jobs came in. Her phone stayed quiet of envelopes and anonymous fixes, and any sign at all that 12 years of careful, secret watching hadn't simply stopped the moment she asked it to. It took her 5 weeks to understand that the silence wasn't him giving up. It was him, finally, keeping his word. Output Final Section 12. Output Final Section 12. The transmission in Bay 2 had been giving her trouble for 3 days when she finally noticed what was actually wrong with it. And what was wrong with it had nothing to do with the transmission at all. It was a Tuesday. She'd been fixing the same sensor for the 3rd time, hands moving on autopilot, mind elsewhere, when Eli leaned into the garage and said, "You've been staring at that same bolt for 10 minutes. And she realized he was right. And she realized why. 5 weeks of silence, 5 weeks of a life that was entirely her own. No envelopes, no anonymous repairs, no quiet immortal presence rearranging the edges of her world without asking. She'd thought she wanted that more than anything. She'd spent 12 years not knowing it had ever been otherwise, and 5 weeks getting it back. And somewhere in those weeks she'd discovered the uncomfortable truth that an empty kind of freedom wasn't what she'd actually been asking for. She hadn't been asking to be alone. She'd been asking to be asked. That night she sat on her porch with coffee black. No creamer. Some habits just hers now, and didn't need explaining, and thought about a man who'd held a stranger against a wall and chosen not to be the worst version of himself, who'd bought 17 kinds of tea trying to get one thing right, who'd funded nothing for her in 5 weeks, not because he'd stopped caring, but because she'd asked him to stop, and he had, completely, at obvious cost to himself, because her word mattered more to him than his own comfort. That wasn't management. She understood that now, sitting on a porch in the quiet, in a way she hadn't been able to see clearly while she was still angry and exhausted, and 3 weeks out of a warehouse. Management would have ignored her. Management would have kept the envelopes coming. Certain it knew better. What he'd actually done was harder than management. He'd let her go and trusted she'd come back on her own terms, or not at all, and either way he'd have lived with it, because the choice had never been his to make in the first place. She drove out to the house 2 days later, no warning, no call ahead, because some things you didn't announce, you just showed up for. The way he'd once shown up for a 16-year-old girl outside a burning building without being invited either. Corwin opened the door before she'd finished knocking, and the smile on his face answered a question she hadn't asked yet. "He's in the garage," Corwin said. "Working on the 67. Badly, I'd let you handle that particular rescue." She found him exactly there, hood up, hands covered in grease he had no idea what to do with, frowning at an engine with the same focused, offended disapproval he'd once given a broken microwave in a story she'd never actually heard him tell. "You're doing that wrong," she said. He turned, and the stillness she'd once found terrifying broke open into something she'd never seen on his face before. Not on the riverbank, not in the waiting room, not at the gate something unguarded, that looked, for the first time, exactly like hope allowed to exist without a contingency plan behind it. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "I'm not staying because I'm grateful," she said, crossing the garage, stepping over a tool he'd clearly set down wrong. "I worked that part out. I'm staying because I missed you in a way gratitude doesn't explain, and because I'd rather be asked into a complicated life than left alone in a simple one." "I wasn't going to ask again," he said. "I promised myself I wouldn't manage even that." "Good thing I'm the one asking, then." She kissed him, before either of them could say anything else, his hands cold and careful at her waist. Grease and river water, and 12 years of quiet watching folding into something neither of them had a word for yet, and somewhere behind them, Corwin made a satisfied sound and went to find a phone charger, because some moments, even after 400 years of service, a man learns to leave alone. The river, when she finally took him back to it months later, looked smaller than she remembered. Just water, ordinary and slow, with nothing in it anymore that could pull her under.